Hello and welcome to my channel. Today's lecture is about the midbrain, so let's begin. The brainstem as a whole is a structure within the posterior cranial fossa that passes through the tentorial notch. Remember the tentorial notch in the tentorium cerebelli? It passes through it on its way to to form the spinal cord as a continuation of the medulla oblongata, and it connects the forebrain and spinal cord. It runs from the rostral to caudal through comprises from rostral to caudal, consists of midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Means the midbrain is the highest structure, then the medulla oblongata is the lowest one that continues as spinal cord, and it acts as a conduit for ascending and descending tracts in the central nervous system. It's also the site or the place for nuclei of cranial nerves 3 through 12, through 12, and it's the location for centers related to respiration, as the respiratory center. Also, it has cardiovascular center to regulate the heartbeats and condition of the vessels throughout the body, and the regulation of consciousness through the reticular formation component of the brainstem. The first structure is the midbrain, mesencephalon. The external features of the midbrain. This is the midbrain. Notice that it's the only structure that has a tectum. The rest is composed of tegmentum, which is continuous throughout the brainstem. It traverses the tentorial notch, as mentioned before, and connects the pons to the cerebellum with the forebrain. The ventral part is the cerebral peduncles, and the ventral part of the cerebral peduncle is the crus cerebri, or sometimes we call the cerebral peduncle as crus cerebri as a whole. The dorsal aspect is the tegmentum, with substantia nigra in between the tegmentum and the crus cerebri, as we will see in cut sections of the midbrain. The interpeduncular fossa contains the anterior perforated substance for the passage of arterial supply of the internal structure of the brain. The tegmentum is traversed by the aqueduct of Sylvius. This is the aqueduct of Sylvius that connects the third ventricle with the fourth ventricle. This is the aqueduct of Sylvius. The tectum is this part. Lies dorsal to the tegmentum, and it has 4 protrusions called together the corpora quadrigemina. 2 superior colliculi and 2 inferior colliculi. The superior colliculi are in the visual pathway, and the inferior colliculi are in the auditory pathway. The superior colliculus connects through the superior brachium to the lateral geniculate nucleus, or the lateral geniculate body, which is part of the visual pathway. And the inferior colliculus connects through the inferior brachium to the medial geniculate body, or the medial geniculate nucleus. We cannot see them here. The tectum also receives the brachium conjunctivum, which is superior cerebellar peduncles, and the tectum is localized to the midbrain, as I told you before, and the rest is composed of tegmentum that comprises the whole brainstem. The tegmentum present in the midbrain, pons, and medulla. So remember, tectum and tegmentum, and the ventral aspect is the crus cerebri, or as a whole it's called the cerebral peduncle. The internal structure of the midbrain, it has a dorsal. This is the dorsum. This is the ventral aspect of the midbrain. Dorsal and central regions separated by the substantia nigra. By the way, in these sections, the white matter is stained black, and gray matter is the light in color. So this is gray matter and this is white matter. This is gray matter and this is white matter. See? The dorsal and central regions are separated by the substantia nigra. This is the substantia nigra. Here you can see this is the cerebral peduncle, or the crus cerebri. This is, by the way, the oculomotor nerve. So this is at the level, the cut section at the level of the superior colliculus. This is the superior colliculus level, and this is the pulvinar of the thalamus, the posterior end of the thalamus. The crus cerebri is the ventral aspect. It's the ventral aspect of the cerebral peduncle. All this is called the cerebral peduncle. The ventral aspect is called the crus cerebri. This is the crus cerebri. It's semilunar in section, as you can see here. Medially, it has frontopontine fibers. Laterally contains parieto or temporoparieto-occipitopontine fibers. So temporoparieto-occipitopontine laterally, frontopontine medially, and in the middle there is the corticospinal tract surrounded by the corticonuclear or the corticobulbar tract. Again, the medial aspect is frontopontine fibers that will relay on the pontine nuclei in the pons. Laterally is the temporoparieto-occipitopontine fibers to different destinations, and in the middle we have the corticospinal tract surrounded on either sides by the corticonuclear or corticobulbar tract. Substantia nigra is this region. This is the substantia nigra. It's a collection of multipolar neurons which are heavily pigmented. That's why it's called substantia nigra. Because in fresh specimens it's dark in color. Extends from the pons to the subthalamus, pons below to subthalamus above, and concave posterior, convex anterior. The posterior part, which is the part you see here, is the pars compacta, and the anterior part, you see that is hairy-like extensions from the substantia nigra. That's why it's called the pars reticularis. So the anterior part of the substantia nigra is the pars reticularis. The posterior part is the pars compacta. The substantia nigra, of course, it's part of the basal ganglia, and we will study it in the and its connection in the basal ganglia lecture. It's connected to the cortex, the spinal cord, the hypothalamus, the subthalamus, basal ganglia, and the reticular formation. So again, the ventral aspect of the cerebral peduncle is the crus cerebri. The medial part is frontopontine fibers. The lateral part is temporoparieto-occipitopontine fibers. In the middle, we have corticospinal and corticobulbar fibers or corticonuclear fibers. Corticonuclear or corticobulbar, the same like corticospinal, but it's to the cranial nerve nuclei. Okay, the same function, but to cranial nerves, not to spinal nerves. We have the substantia nigra. The posterior part is pars compacta. The anterior part is pars reticularis. This is the red nucleus, the one you see here. and this is the oculomotor nerve, and these are the oculomotor nerve nuclei. We will come to this later. Tegmentum of the midbrain. This is the tegmentum of the midbrain. It's variable with sections and continues with that of the pons and medulla, and with same tracts. The periaqueductal gray. This is the aqueduct of Sylvius. See, this is the periaqueductal gray. The trochlear nucleus, it gives trochlear nerve that goes lateral and dorsal. It's not showing here because we need a level at the inferior colliculus level. This is the trochlear nerve is present at the inferior colliculus level. This is the level of the superior colliculus. This is the oculomotor nerve. Goes lateral and dorsal and emerges below inferior colliculus and decussate in the superior medullary velum. Remember, the superior medullary velum, it's the roof of the fourth ventricle formed by the cerebellum. The mesencephalic nucleus of the trigeminal receives proprioceptions from muscles, proprioception from muscles of mastication. Remember the muscles of mastication, the temporalis, masseter, and the pterygoids, medial and lateral pterygoid muscles. You will find these in the head and neck sessions. Reticular formation. Multiple nuclei comprise the reticular formation of the midbrain, like nucleus cuneiformis, subcuneiformis, median nucleus or raphe nuclei in the midbrain, and the lateral nucleus is called the parabrachialis nucleus. All these are reticular formation nuclei with multiple functions and is connected to or related to consciousness. It's very important for the reticular formation nuclei. The white matter is the superior cerebellar peduncle decussation of brachium conjunctivum on the way to the red nucleus. Brachium conjunctivum is the superior cerebellar peduncle. And the medial longitudinal fasciculus from vestibular nuclei, especially the medial vestibular nucleus, that divides into ascending part and descending parts. The ascending part goes to the cranial nerve and nuclei above it, and the interstitial nucleus of thalamus. It's called the interstitial nucleus of Kegel in the wall of the third ventricle. And descending part to cranial nerve nuclei, rest of the cranial nerve nuclei, and the spinal cord as the medial vestibulospinal tract. The medial lemniscus, medial lemniscus that carries fine touch and proprioception. The spinal lemniscus carries crude touch and temperature sensation. Trigeminal lemniscus carries sensations from the head, and the lateral lemniscus is in the auditory pathway. All are dorsolateral to the substantia nigra. You will find them all here in this area. The medial lemniscus, spinal lemniscus, trigeminal lemniscus, and the lateral lemniscus. Oculomotor nerve nuclei. This is at the superior colliculus level. These are the oculomotor nerve nuclei. This is the motor nucleus, and this is what's so-called the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, which is ventral to the motor nucleus of the oculomotor, giving rise to the oculomotor nerve, as you can see here. The motor nucleus, of course, to supply the extraocular muscles, and the Edinger-Westphal nucleus is the parasympathetic component of the oculomotor nerve, responsible for pupillary reflex, pupillary constriction to be precise, and accommodation reflex. The red nucleus is the one you see here. This is the red nucleus. It's a collection of multipolar neurons, dorsal to substantia nigra, dorsal to substantia nigra. It's present at the superior colliculus level. It's rose in color in fresh specimens. That's why it's called red nucleus. And it has an upper reticular part and lower compact part. Upper reticular part and lower compact part. The upper reticular part actually goes through the subthalamus to be part of the subthalamic nuclei. The red nucleus also is part of the upper part of the red nucleus is part of the basal ganglia. Afferents to red nucleus from somatosensory cortex, it's called corticorubral fibers. From the cerebellum, via the superior cerebellar peduncle, the superior colliculus, the spinal cord, the subthalamus, the hypothalamus, and the substantia nigra. So these are the afferents for the red nucleus. The efferents from the red nucleus is the rubrospinal tract, is the main outflow. It accompanies the corticospinal tract. It's called the indirect corticospinal tract. The function is still not understood, very well understood, but it controls the voluntary movements as the corticospinal tract. It's called indirect corticospinal and crosses in what's so-called the ventral tegmental decussation. Ventral tegmental decussation, you will find it here. Ventral tegmental decussation. Also the efferents beginning of tectospinal and tectobulbar tracts means coming from the tectum, from the superior colliculus to be precise. It decussates in the dorsal tegmental decussation to cranial nerves, especially those of the extraocular muscles, means 3, 4, and 6 cranial nerves, the oculomotor to the trochlear and the abducens nerve, and the spinal cord. They coordinate the body and eye movement reflexes. These are done by the tectospinal or tectospinal tract, and actually it goes mainly to the neck region of the spinal cord. Dorsal tegmental tract in the central gray matter of all brain stem and connects the cranial nerve nuclei together. Also, there's central tegmental tract or central tegmental fasciculus, or the CTT. It's previously called the thalamo-olivary tract. From the thalamus to the olive. It's more prominent in the medulla oblongata because the olive is in the inferior olive is in the medulla oblongata. And fibers form the corpus from the corpus striatum, which is the anterior end of the lentiform nucleus plus the caudate nucleus. Together they are called the corpus striatum. Fibers from the red nucleus and the cerebral cortex and the thalamus. That's why it was called previously the thalamo-olivary tract. The tectum of the midbrain has corpora quadrigemina, as we mentioned before, the two superior colliculi and 2 inferior colliculi. The inferior colliculus, it's an ovoid nucleus derived from the periaqueductal gray. The main afferent is the lateral lemniscus, which is the auditory pathway. Efferent through the inferior brachium means through the connection with the medial geniculate body or the medial geniculate nucleus. While the superior colliculus afferents from the retina because it's in the visual pathway. The spinal cord, these fibers are called the spinotectal, inferior colliculus also, and occipital and temporal cortex called corticotectal fibers. Efferents from the superior colliculus is the tectospinal, the tectonuclear or tectobulbar to extraocular muscles nerve nuclei, tectotegmental to the reticular formation in the brainstem, and to lateral geniculate body or lateral geniculate nucleus along superior brachium, all decussate in the dorsal tegmental decussation. Dorsal tegmental decussation. The fibers decussate. The pretectal nucleus, it's present in front of the colliculi, the superior colliculus, and receives afferent from occipital cortex and optic tract. It's part of the visual pathway. Efferents to both accessory oculomotor or Edinger-Westphal nuclei, because they are especially those to the medial recti muscles. Remember the medial and lateral recti muscles, extraocular muscles. These are fibers to the medial recti muscles, responsible for convergence in accommodation reflex. Accommodation reflex is the reflex initiated when you look at near objects, a convergence of both eyes towards the object, and with pupillary constriction to limit the amount of light entering the eye. This is the accommodation reflex, and controlled by the pretectal nucleus, the one we are studying now. The blood supply of the midbrain comes from branches of the superior cerebellar. Remember, it's a branch of the basilar artery, and direct branches from the basilar artery and the posterior cerebral artery, the terminal branch of the basilar artery. They are all part of the vertebrobasilar system. Lesions of midbrain, lesions of the basal part, which is the crus cerebri. Remember, we talked about the corticospinal or corticonuclear fibers, so we expect a hemiplegia, contralateral hemiplegia, because these fibers lower down in the medulla, they decussate. This is called Weber's syndrome, in which crus cerebri and oculomotor nerve of one side are affected. So the extraocular muscles of the same side will be affected, and the contralateral hemiplegia. The affection, the involvement of the oculomotor, the involvement of the oculomotor nerve causes strabismus, which is squint of the same side eye, plus ptosis, which is dropping of the eyelid. And because of loss of the parasympathetic tone of the pupils, there will be dilated pupils. Dilated pupils called mydriasis. Mydriasis, okay? So we have a contralateral hemiplegia, the ipsilateral ptosis, and strabismus, and mydriasis. Lesions in the tegmentum, it's called the Benedict syndrome. It involves the oculomotor nerve, so the same as the Weber's. There will be strabismus of the same side eye, ptosis, and mydriasis. But because we are in the tegmentum now, deeper structures, we have the medial lemniscus, so loss of the fine touch and proprioception. Involvement also of the red nucleus and the superior cerebellar peduncle. This leads to ataxia, cerebellar ataxia. So it's same side oculomotor and decreased proprioception from the opposite side, and cerebellar ataxia of the opposite side. see the difference between Benedict's and Weber's. Lesions in the tectum impaired because remember the superior colliculi, I told you they control the convergence in accommodation reflex. So impaired conjugate eye movement plus pupillary effects is called the Parinod's pupil. This is the lesions. These are the lesions, a few lesions of the midbrain, so as to know the effect of impairment of the blood supply of the midbrain. Well, I hope you got the maximum benefit from this lecture, and thank you very much for watching.